Hi guys, in this video, I'm going to have an exam review session with a past paper. The paper that I'll do today is CIE A-Level Economics, Paper 4 from 23 October-November exam. Shall we start? Section A, question 1. This is about economic decline in 2020. I'm answering this question after reading all the extracts and data. So let me just start with the first question. A. With reference to Table 1.1, what indicates that Japan's government had borrowed substantially? What indicates the Japanese government's substantial borrowing can be found from its national debt data, and actually it is more than twice the size of the country's GDP, which is 337% of GDP in 2019. Question B. Although Japan was the world's fourth largest exporter, it had suffered trade deficits. Explain how this might have happened. Even if the country is one of the biggest exporters, if the value of imports was bigger than the value of exports, it could cause trade deficits. Also, the declining business performance of the country itself can be a factor as well, such as loss of export sales reflected in declining industrial production, as we have read from the case of Toyota. Also, the tensions between trade giants like USA and China, this could have also affected the worst performance, since 19% of Japan's exports go to those two countries. So I believe both could have affected the export performance negatively. Question C. Consider whether the evidence provided shows that Japan's economic decline in 2020 was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. My mini essay can start with a summary of Japanese economic data, like its consecutive GDP decline and economic growth rate change. My body one can explain the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the country's economy. Like I can explain Japan's economic decline in 2020 was certainly exacerbated by the coronavirus. And to support the idea, I can use the IMF figures, such as the lockdown, which worsened the domestic consumption and export trade in many industrial goods like cars. However, I should say that actually the decline was ongoing even before the pandemic. Like the decline was part of a much longer term decline in the country's economy. And to prove that, I can use the data from the table to explain that the economic decline was evident in the past years, like 2016, 17, etc. And also the text identifies that the country was in the 2 decades of decline before 2011 due to the deflation and economic stagnation. So I reckon that maybe not the COVID-19, but the policies like imposing higher sales tax in 2019 could somehow better explain the declining domestic consumption pattern, like the decrease in retail sales from like 0.6 to 0.1. Question D. Low interest rates have been used by Japan's central bank since 2016. Analyze how low interest rates might stimulate an economy and evaluate whether their use has been successful in stimulating Japan's economy since 2016. Okay, the intro will define lowering interest rates as an expansionary monetary policy. Theoretically, low interest rate would boost the economy by encouraging consumers and investors to take more risks when borrowing. Also, low interest rates should discourage saving and increase consumption. To illustrate the theory, I can draw a money market diagram shifting to the right, the supply shifting to the right, and also ADAS diagram shifting AD to the right to explain the mechanism. Moving on, I can evaluate the policy's effectiveness on Japanese economy. Yes, the policy appears to have worked best in 2017 when industrial production and retail sales all improved quite significantly, like making the highest rate of economic growth year on year. However, it was not really lasting since the pattern of retail sales shrunk after that. Also, Japan's industrial production has declined quite significantly after 2017. Not only that, there was the fall in exports, trade wars, and high levels of public debt all have continued to lead to more stagnation in the country. So all have been worsened during the pandemic in 2020. So I can conclude that the policy, the monetary policy, was not quite sustainable enough to be regarded as a successful policy when it comes to boosting deeply stagnating country's economy. For section B, I'm going to go for question 2. Question 2. The provision of healthcare by the public sector is inefficient, and therefore all healthcare should be provided by firms operating in the private sector. Evaluate this comment. My intro will include definitions of healthcare as both necessity and merit goods, and I'm also going to define private sector provision and public provision. First discussion will be about agreement to the comment. What should be understood is that private sector firms' primary business objective is to maximize their profits. And such pursuit of profit maximization will lead private firms to cut their costs and reduce any unnecessary inefficiencies in bureaucratic system, which can lead to a more efficient use of scarce resources within the healthcare system. Also, the competition amongst private firms may lead quality of healthcare service being improved, which is not existing in public sector provision. Not only that, the substitution of public provision by private provision might enable additional resources to become available in the public sector so that the opportunity cost of public provision will decrease. And too often cases, government failures are observed. So to prove the government failures, I can use the real-world example of NHS and compare the system with other countries' healthcare system that adopt private healthcare system or hybrid healthcare system, which works better, I want to say. So that's the end of first discussion. My second discussion will be about disagreement to the comment. First, I can point out the fact that private firms are likely to aim only profit, maximizing their profits. So this might lead to a higher cost of receiving healthcare to the consumers. Also, the private providers of healthcare are unlikely to provide an allocatively efficient level of healthcare because of a failure of taking into account of the additional benefits of positive externalities. They don't necessarily need to consider that matter since they are private. Also, if access to healthcare in the private sector is based on ability to pay in the private sector, this might create inequitable outcomes in society. In this regard, there can be even higher negative externalities and social costs that government might need to pay if it is not equitably provided. So that's why I can agree to the public provision in a way. Also, indirect support of the government can sometimes be more inefficient, such as government spends some budget on advertising. Those kind of things can be often way more costly and not very certain to observe the effectiveness of it. So maybe that can be more wasteful. So to support the disagreement to the comment, I can use the real world example of the US, where it has quite a large disparity in healthcare service accessibility between rich and poor people because the country adopts private provision of healthcare system. My conclusion will say that considering the very nature of healthcare, probably equity should be prioritized over efficiency, presumably, yes. For section C, I'm gonna go for question 4. As always, I'm gonna define monetary policy and unemployment this time as one of the macroeconomic issues. Yeah, and in body 1, I can analyze how monetary policy works to lower a certain type of unemployment. In this analysis, I will focus on expansionary monetary policy, especially its nature of being demand-side measures. And I'm going to explain different types of expansionary monetary policies, such as lowering interest rates, using quantitative easing, and exchange rate market intervention. And I can further analyze how lowering interest rate can lower cyclical unemployment. Also, how quantitative easing or exchange rate market intervention can reduce the level of cyclical unemployment, the way it works theoretically. And I'm also going to draw a money market diagram, shifting the money supply curve to the right. And for the ADAS diagram, I can shift AD to the right to illustrate the analysis above. Probably the real life example of Japan's zero interest rate policy can be used. Next, I can talk about some limitations of effectiveness of monetary policies. Considering the nature of monetary policy, which is largely demand-side measure, it is not very effective when unemployment is largely supply-side oriented one, such as structural unemployment, frictional, and seasonal. In this case, probably alternative policies might work better, like supply-side policies. I can probably use Phillips curve to demonstrate the analysis of it. Also, I can analyze the fact that lowering interest rate might cause problems for specific industries within an economy, such as lower interest rate might cause a boom in the housing market unintentionally. So it's again unintended inflation in a certain market. So I'm going to use a real life example of South Korea, which had an excessive real estate market boom during the low interest rate period in late 2010. Yeah, maybe that can work. I can conclude that using monetary policy for lowering unemployment should be actually carefully attempted by considering the type of unemployment that is largely occurring in the economy. Also, there are policies potential trade-off effect, so that's why it has to be really careful. And I can say that its effectiveness as well is not always guaranteed. All right, this is the end of paper 4. Thanks for watching. Bye.